I'd like to welcome to the show writer and director of the film Funny Face, Tim Sutton. How are you today?
I'm well. Thanks for having me.
I'm excited to talk about the film today, but before we dive into the film, Tom, what was your first job in the movie industry?
I was a production assistant.
Yeah.
I was a production assistant in commercials. I moved to New York, and I had one friend of a family friend who was a production coordinator or production manager in commercials, and he hired me, and I worked there on like bad commercials, like Vagistat commercials and stuff like that, and then got a job at R. Greenberg Associates, which did the titles for Superman and was more of like an effects house.
Funny Face is about the destruction of his grandparents' home, leads a young man to revenge under a masked persona. Where did the concept and the idea behind the film come from?
Well, I had lived in New York for a long time and had never made a movie here for various reasons, logistic, financial, but also creative. I figured if I was going to make a movie in New York, it had to be a quote unquote New York movie. Like it had to really kind of stand up in its own way to the New York genre. And I consider movies like Taxi Driver and Bad Lieutenant and Requiem for a Dream and Stranger in Paradise, but even movies like Manhattan or When Harry Met Sally. I really wanted to make a movie that wasn't at the level of those movies, but certainly took an angle on New York and made it its own. And at the same time, gentrification is a major issue, not just in New York, but lots of other cities where money is kind of taking over and money is the new culture. And I wanted to tell a story about that, but I didn't want it to be a straightforward social issue movie. So I kind of found the vehicle for the Coney Island mask, the mask that represents Coney Island and kind of represents an old New York, an old school New York, and kind of decided to weave a DIY kind of punk rock superhero origin story out of that.
Yeah, and to kind of follow that for me, technically speaking, and I'll dive into that portion first, but the film is just gorgeous, from the cinematography to the fantastic score to the locations. Take us behind the idea of utilizing that entire city to your advantage, but also kind of sprinkling in this score, because there's a lot of little moments in the film, not a lot of dialogue, but you let the cinematography, you let the score kind of do the talking in between there. Mm-hmm. So take us kind of behind the idea of that.
Sure. Well, I mean, I want to credit both the cinematographer, Lucas Gaff, and the composer, Phil Mossman, with their, really vibrant and also original work. First of all, movies are moving images. To me, silent movies can be more powerful than dialogue-based movies. I think you learn a lot from what people say, but I think you learn even more from where people are and how they interact with their environment and what their environment looks like. People in a landscape. That's the movie. When Cosmo and Dela are sitting on a bench, having a snack. It's about what the light looks like, and also like what the soft sounds of the music sound like, not as much what they're saying. So Lucas and I went at it with the idea of like, how can you make one image totally gritty and then the next image next to it totally sublime and totally beautiful, and have that all match? Because that's what Brooklyn really is, and that's kind of what the story is it's this juxtaposing of Saul on the cracked sidewalks and the dilapidated buildings with Johnny Lee Miller's developer character who's being chauffeured around, almost always behind glass, looking out at the city from a perch. So it was about creating a cinematic language that was both high and low, but that worked together. When we're out in the street at night, it's a lot of neon lights from the bodegas or from the street lights that we're using. And Lucas did a really good job. He comes from documentary originally, so he did a really good job with less. Phil, this is the second time I worked with Phil. He also did my score with Donnybrook. And the most important thing for me with Phil was that it should sound like a daydream of Coney Island. It should have a little bit of some kind of distant, mystic Ferris wheel in the background. You know what I mean? And I also didn't want to recognize the instruments. So I didn't want to know that this was a snare drum, and I didn't want to know that this was a trombone. I wanted it to feel otherworldly. I wanted it to feel unrecognizable. And at the same time, just like Lucas, it had to be extreme. It had to be both kind of frightening and filled with rage, but it also had to be soft and kind of a sad lullaby at the same time. So going from the extremes, both sound and picture, sublime and gritty, sad and angry, all at once. And they did fantastic work, both of them.
Yeah, I even put in my review, I said this, the score reminds you of like a rock concert, right? And several times you kind of drop the beat and it kind of leaves you in awe, and it kind of puts together exactly the pieces that you just mentioned. For me, the writing really stands out, especially when you're talking about Cosmo Jarvis as Saul. A lot of the times when we're trying to identify or connect to a character, and it's this good bad guy type of scenario. But I think the one difference with Saul that you wrote, yes, he was a loner. Yes, he was awkward and not so personable, and doesn't even really not, he doesn't know how to do the little things of life, like drive and stuff like that. But I wouldn't put him exactly in the villainous category because his motives are pure, yet he kind of goes about them uncharacteristically. Is that your kind of idea of writing the character?
Yeah, I mean, the most important thing and what we both agreed on right away is that, Brooklyn is filled with hipsters, and we didn't want Saul to be a hipster. Like, we didn't want him to be cool. We wanted him to be kind of a loser who didn't know how to. The world is kind of leaving him behind. New York feels like it's leaving him behind a little bit. So we wanted to have this person who had a soul, had a huge soul, but like didn't know how to figure out how to stop bad things from happening. And so that's what happens, is like, he's a really good guy who doesn't know how I'm trying to figure out the best way to say it. It's like, he's a really good guy who can't get anywhere, and that's frustrating. And so what he does with that frustration, it becomes dangerous. And I think that happens to a lot of people. And I wouldn't say he fulfills that danger, because what he's really looking for through his anger, through his frustration, through his isolation, is not revenge. He's looking for someone to love, and someone to take care of, and someone to love him and take care of him. And I think that's more important than the revenge story. But Cosmo's the type of actor who, I really believe he can do anything. His preparation, his talent is just incredible. We wanted to create someone who felt real, and also kind of like, kind of like almost a caricature of what a Brooklyn punk is. He's kind of, I think of him as one of the Ramones who never made it. You know what I mean? He's just kind of like, he's got a thick accent. He feels like he's kind of timeless. Is he from the 50s? Is he from the 70s? Is he from the 90s? And he's a lovable guy who just doesn't know what to do with all his anger.
For me, you kind of answered some of the question about Cosmo. Was fantastic. I think that he took the words that you put on paper and then the direction that you kind of gave him and kind of ran with it.
For sure.
In that process of figuring out who your Saul was going to be, what stood out the most about Cosmo?
I mean, again, like Cosmo, I met some more recognizable actors, even though I think Cosmo is going to be a very recognizable actor, depending
I
on the
agree with
parts he gets.
100%.
I met with some guys, and they played it more kind of like tongue in cheek, or played it more cool. And Cosmo's first intuition was that he's not cool, that he's a struggling, isolated, loser to and that was important. Cosmo's ability then, surpassed my expectations, because he's from one end, he's kind of a mystery. From one angle, he's kind of unattractive and abrasive, and from another angle, he looks like Marlon Brando. I mean, he's handsome and incredible looking. So he has this kind of strange, amorphous, kind of chameleon-like form that when he plopped down in Coney Island, and he never broke character, was always had the accent, was always Saul, was never Cosmo, and he kind of blended right into this Coney Island world, not this Brooklyn world that you walk down the street today, but this unique world that he created as much as I did. This character is both completely real and completely magical at the same time.
The film starts, you think it's going to go one way, and then we meet Zema, and who's played by Dela Meskienyar. Is that how you say it? Meskienyar. Mm-hmm. And she's remarkable. And I feel like when she enters the screen, we go from this, what we kind of expect to be this kind of crazy story, into, in what I say is one of the best love stories told on the big screen in a long time. Was it always meant to be that way? Yeah,
it's a love story through and through. I mean, my New York movie was always going to try and be, have the vibe of a gritty and sublime taxi driver, but it was always going to be a love story. And I think that's what I think some people are not necessarily picking up on, because yes, it's set up as a bit of an origin story. Yes, it's set up as a bit of a revenge story, but that's not necessarily how life goes. And so, you might want revenge, and you might try and get revenge, but at the same time, you're kind of hungry and you like this girl. And so why not go have lunch together and get to know each other? And I think that's what the beauty of this story is Zama's ability not to judge Saul, but to be his partner, and to be, she's filled with rage and she's filled with confusion just as much as he is. They show it in different ways, they personify it in different ways, but they're partners. They see eye to eye from the minute they meet. They are partners, and it truly is love at first sight. It's not a typical love story, but what great love story is typical,
Exactly. And I think it's the little moments in the film that really stand out to me, the power of their relationship. When you're outside of the bar that one night where he just is beating that guy almost to death. If she's not standing there, he probably beats her to death, right? And it's those little moments where even in the car, he gets frustrated about the Knicks, you know what I mean? And his battle with the Knicks and the Nets. And to me, how they're intertwined and their chemistry, what was it about Della that kind of brought her to the forefront to be opposite of Cosmo?
Well, I mean, it definitely took work. I mean, first of all, Cosmo is not the easiest actor to work with. He tests you, as he tested me, he tested the cinematographer, he tested the producers, he tested Della, and Della was relatively inexperienced by design. We really wanted to have someone who had never, a real discovery. We auditioned, I would say, 50 to 60 people, and she just kind of blew us away. She knew what she was doing. At the same time, she had both a sense of wisdom, but also a sense of kind of vulnerability and a bit of innocence that made sense for Zama. Zama is, what was important was that it's not Saul's story with Zama as a sidekick, which I think some people are latching onto just because Zama plays it very differently. Zama is a very different character, and of course, we needed someone who was going to make the role personal. Saul's role, Cosmo it's not personal. It's a total, character dive. Where Zama, it was important because as a white male writer and director, it was important if I was going to, have this character, this Muslim woman character, she had to own it and she had to bring herself to it. And she had to tell me what Zama would do in these places. And she really did that. And frankly, their chemistry took a little while to get going because they were both, figuring it out. But I do feel like by the time, they end together, by that parking lot scene at the end, they can't live without each other. I mean, of course they're together. And I think that's a real testament to Dela's perseverance and her ability to kind of work her way through the movie with Cosmo's help, but also in opposition to Cosmo, like really pushing for her own place in the movie at the same time.
Yeah, before I let you go, I want to talk about that ending, and I won't dive into it too much, but spoiler wise, just for the people that when they listen to this, but for me, that final sequence when he's sitting in that parking lot, in my head, I was like, all right, Tim, what are you doing to me here? Like, because you see him by himself, right? And you don't see him inside the parents' house, right? Whenever she goes back home. And you kind of feel like there might have been finally like a mutual separation, even though you knew, me as watching it knew that these two were basically inseparable. That ending, was that the original ending from Go?
Mm-hmm.
It was.
Yep.
Yeah, it's I again, and Tim, I just want to really thank you for your time today in discussing the film. It's something different and unique and a breath of fresh air. And I genuinely mean, like, it's one of the best love stories that, you're right, you find love in the most unique places, and you could have gone 75 different ways with the character of Saul and his destruction of him, but instead you highlight what it's like to meet one person and how that can change your life. So
yeah, I mean, it's like, I think there's a darkness to this movie, but in so many ways, I mean, I think it ends with the great hope that all it takes is one person to show you that life goes on. You know what I mean? That you can live, that you can exist. And in this story, it's absolutely about two people being there for each other, even at the end when it's it's not explicit as much as it is implicit. They're together, and that's what matters.